Welcome to another episode of Science and Research in Singapore. Today's guest is Marlena, who is doing her PhD in the Coral Reef Ecogeomorphology Lab and will be sharing with us her work on reefs in Singapore. So Marlena, I'm going to ask you something that most people have actually asked me. Singapore got corals, meh?
That's actually a question I get a lot, even from Singaporeans. Many people don't know that Singapore has coral reefs. But it does, in the southern islands. And one thing that's special about Singaporean reefs is that they're turbid reefs. Turbid means that there's a lot of mud or sediment particles suspended in the water column. Sometimes so much that you don't see the corals.
Since our reefs are so turbid, right? How can the corals survive? I thought they need clear waters and enough sunlight.
So that's something that a lot of researchers are actually currently working on because we don't fully understand yet. But one thing we know is that certain corals are more resilient to these suspended particles and the limited light they get. But my research actually focuses more on the mud that actually settles on the reef.
So what does sand and mud have to do with corals?
So the mud that settles on top of the corals really stresses them because mud carries pollutants and it's also very fine, so the corals can't get rid of it. Right? So corals actually have skeletons, they're animals, and when corals die, the skeletons will break down and they will produce sand. If more mud is deposited on the reefs, how many corals actually die and how does that affect the production of sand?
So if I understood correctly what you just said, corals produce sand.
Yes.
Why is sand important?
So first of all, we do need sand to support our beaches, support coastlines, but we also need sand inside the coral reef because if there's sand, then organisms can live on it. If you have too much mud, the corals will suffer and they also can't settle on the mud because the mud is too soft. So they can't find surfaces to attach to. Also, filter-feeding organisms like mollusks, they won't be able to filter feed anymore if there's too much mud that's burying them. So it's really important to keep that balance of mud and sand, and we don't want to have too much mud on the reef.
What are the factors influencing the amount of sand that can be formed in our coastlines?
One of the things that affects it is the input of mud. And the input of mud is controlled by input from land. So if you have a big river, that river will put in the fine, muddy sediment. Or if you have a lot of rainfalls, that will also input mud into the water. But then there's also other things like human disturbances. So if you have land reclamation or dredging or a lot of ship traffic, this mud will get resuspended, also actively deposited in the waters. So that's a big problem for the corals.
So based on your research, right, what do you think is the future of coral reefs in Southeast Asia and the rest of the world?
In Singaporean reefs, you do see a transition from low mud reefs that thrive under the natural conditions, and then the high mud reefs where you have high inputs and lower coral cover. Urbanization continues across the world, and especially in Southeast Asia where you have a lot of people. These reefs we see in Singapore might be the future of urbanized reefs in tropical regions especially.